Chapter 11 deals with racial oppression and conflict in early California. In the years following the gold rush, a large majority of American citizens of California, people who had come here from, other parts of the world, who were mostly Anglo, believed in the innate superiority of whites to other races, of course referring to themselves. So, Anglo-Americans adopted laws and ordinances in early California that gave them legal sanction to discriminate against people who were not like themselves. And the discrimination was rampant against Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese, Indians, and African Americans in early California. Many Mexican miners came to California from the northern state of Sonora in Mexico, hence the town of Sonora that bears the name of that Mexican state in Tuolumne County. The Mexican miners were more experienced than the Anglo-American miners. So the Mexicans would say that jealous white men, or gringos envidiosos, would attack them. There was a foreign miner's license tax of $20 a month that was enacted in 1850. It was repealed in 1851 and then reenacted in a more moderate form after that. But you can see that clearly early California laws and rules and regulations, they really wanted to discriminate against people who were not Anglo-Saxon. There was no question. It was blatant. There was also the Vagrancy Act of 1855, which criminalized people that whites called greasers. There were also troubles with land and title to land. Even though the U.S. government in 1851 determined that its general policy toward the determination of titles to the vast lands that had been granted under Mexico, it took many more years to actually secure the approval of those title claims, meaning that the lands that were granted to the Californios prior to statehood were supposed to be honored, but it took a long, long time for those land grants to be validated by the new American government, so to speak. One of the issues was that the Mexican system of determining land ownership was lax and vague compared to the American way of doing things. The American system required that such claims be defined exactly and clearly, whereas the Mexican system of delineating which land belonged to whom used the term often of poco más o menos, more or less, and that was too vague for American standards. The American settlers of California couldn't believe that a few hundred Mexican grantees would be permitted to monopolize 13 million acres of land, little of it visibly improved in their eyes, and much of it entirely unoccupied. So American settlers felt in that sense they were superior. On the left is a map of a Mexican land grant, and you can see that the more arbitrary and subjective way that the Mexican government prior to California statehood kept track of such land. Whereas when the Americans took over, there was a more formal plat map drawn for these grants based on President Thomas Jefferson's rectangular survey system, which of course we use today. This is a map of Spanish and Mexican land grants in the Bay Area from the mid-1770s until the mid-1800s. Most of the claims did not represent land that had long been in the possession of the Californios as their homes. Many of those land grants were actually dated within the last 5 years before the American conquest, and many of them may have been signed by Mexican governors after they had been forced out of office and antedated. So there was a certain amount of controversy there. Just prior to statehood, a certain amount of land speculation began. For instance, Thomas Larkin, who you heard about in a previous chapter, purchased nearly 200,000 acres of land before statehood. There was a report examining the validity of land claims, which was released in 1849, and it stated that most of such claims were in fact fraudulent. This emboldened the settlers, meaning the people coming from the East Coast and elsewhere in the world, to settle on such claims. They were referred to themselves as settlers, but they were less favorably described as squatters. There were several incidents of violence ensued. The most tragic amongst them was the squatter riot in Sacramento in 1850. Sacramento was located on a grant made by Alvarado to Sutter. That grant was eventually upheld as being valid. Squatters were on land owned by people who purchased it from Sutter. James McClatchy was on the side of the squatters in the early 1850s. In fact, he was sort of the patriarch of the McClatchy family, who ultimately later on started the Sacramento Bee newspaper, and I think it was 1856, and then all of the Bee newspapers up and down the valley here in California. There was a fellow by the name of William Carey Jones, and he was a young attorney in California who was appointed by the United States Secretary of the Interior at the time to make yet another investigation into the validity of land claims in California, land titles in California. Jones is well connected. Guess what? He was married to a sister of Jessie Benton Fremont, and of course, Jessie Benton Fremont was the wife of John C. Fremont, so I'd say he was well connected. So he was John C. Fremont's brother-in-law, and he was Senator Benton's son-in-law. Remember, Jessie Benton Fremont was the daughter of Senator Benton, and I think he was from Missouri. So happened that John C. Fremont purchased the only Mexican land grant on which large amounts of gold were subsequently discovered. How about that for... Well, is that really a coincidence, or did he have inside information? Jones's interpretation was that Mexican land grants were mostly perfect titles. This, of course, irritated the claimants and the settlers of these lands to a great extent, as you might imagine. Then there was the California Land Act of 1851, which was introduced to Congress by Senator William Gwin. Remember him in a previous chapter. He was the chief political spokesman for the American settlers in California, known to some as squatters. He established this act established a board of 3 commissioners who were to be appointed by the President of the United States. All lands of rejected claims were to be considered public land. There was an appeal process set up for the claimant, both the claimants and the government, in order for this to go to the Supreme Court if necessary. From January 1852 to March 1856, the board held hearings. All but one of those hearings were held in San Francisco. Only one was held in Los Angeles at the time. Northern California certainly pulled the weight at this point in early California history. Of the more than 800 cases presented to that board, that commission of 3, all but a few were appealed to district courts, and 99 were appealed up to the Supreme Court. 604 claims involving 9 million acres were confirmed. 209 claims involving 4 million acres were rejected. And the average length of time, get this, the average length of time required to secure evidence of ownership of these land grants was 17 years. By the time, if you owned one of those big tracts of land, by the time 17 years old around, you were selling land at a discounted price. Why? Because you couldn't confirm its title. And, of course, the attorneys at the time who were in this business were sucking up a lot of your wealth. So by the time the process was completed, if you owned one of those big land grants as a Californio before statehood, it's highly probable that by the time the process was over, you did not have a whole lot of that land left, and you were probably bankrupt, which was most unfortunate. It was really the lawyers who made an awful lot of money off of the grant holders as these things were winding their way through the courts and the hearings. We mentioned earlier that John C. Fremont had the only land grant that actually yielded gold, that was actually in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. He had claim to a grant called Las Mariposas, which means the butterflies in Spanish. This was the only Mexican land grant in the Mother Lode region, and of course that was the area where most of the gold was found. He purchased it from the original grantee, and then gold was discovered on it 2 years later. Lucky guy. Now, although the original recipient of the grant had not fulfilled the required conditions, Fremont's land claim was confirmed. This was a strange grant because it was considered a floating grant, which meant that the total area stayed the same, but the boundaries were not specified. And so the boundaries were actually changed to include 3 mining districts, which were not originally or previously claimed by Fremont. So obviously Fremont was well connected, and he kind of could do what he wanted. Several lives were lost in an attempt to evict miners who had claims on this land that Fremont ultimately took over. There was a great deal of discrimination against people of color or national origin other than Anglo-Saxon. Here is an image of a Chinese miner. This comes from your publisher's resources, the publisher of our textbook, McGraw-Hill. And there was a lot of Chinese immigration at one point because in 1851 in China, the Taiping Rebellion took place against the Manchu dynasty, and this caused a lot of strife and a lot of poverty. And prior to that rebellion in China, there had been about 200 years of periodic economic depression in China, and that forced a lot of Chinese to immigrate to parts of Southeast Asia. And then that Southeast Asian area became kind of a launching pad for people who ended up going to California. Even though they lived in Southeast Asia, they were originally of East Asian or Chinese origin, and they were all wanting to go to get rich quickly in the California gold fields. And they referred to California as Gom Sam, which is, I believe, in Chinese mountain of gold. They mostly came on a very exploitive credit ticket system. That meant that the Chinese who came over on boats across the Pacific, their labor was sold in advance to Chinese mining companies in exchange for their passage. So it was kind of an indentured servitude or almost a slavery situation. They, too, were also subject to monthly foreigners' miners' license taxes, which were quite prohibitive and discriminatory in nature. In 1854, California Supreme Court Judge Hugh C. Murray declared that the Chinese were California Indians, of all things. Therefore, they were not allowed to testify in court, just like their Indian and black counterparts. Sorry for the typos. The California legislature used the 1790 federal law, which only allowed free white persons to vote, as a template for this. And they used it as a basis, really, for all kinds of discrimination. Such discrimination was not officially outlawed until, get this, 1952. That's correct, when discrimination in U.S. naturalization laws finally went away. So it took nearly 100 years to, at least in a statutory way, take care of this problem. Then there was the question of Native Americans in California, or Indians. There was a federal commission that was established in 1850 that negotiated 18 treaties affecting 139 tribes or bands of California Indians. And those agreements stipulated that Indians must acknowledge the jurisdiction of the U.S., they must refrain from all hostilities, and cede all claims to territory that they had to the U.S. In exchange, the Indians were promised provisions, cattle, and large tracts of land, and that land totaled about 7.5% of the land area of California. Only a small number of California Indians actually moved to these reservations, even on a temporary basis, so they were not very popular amongst the Indians. The legislature was very careful to distinguish between who they called wild or hostile Indians and the Indians who were more tame or useful, the ones under the influence of the old mission system who could be a labor force for, you guessed it, white settlers. Due to the vehement objection of the U.S. senators from California, all of the proposed Indian treaties were rejected by the U.S. Senate, and the reservation system that was proposed was completely aborted. Congress had no intention of providing as much for the Indians as that original system proposed. There was a smaller reservation system that was implemented and administered by Edward F. Beale, who was, I guess, the administrator of the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time, and that was under an act that was passed in 1853. These reservations under Beale became what were described as dreary and unproductive places. Nonetheless, this was the model that was adopted for Indian reservations. John McDougall, who was the governor in California in 1854, asserted that 100,000 Indian warriors were in a state of armed rebellion against California. This was totally false because they all spoke different languages and they were quite scattered around the state, so it was highly unlikely there'd be any kind of a revolt. So this caused white settlers to have all kinds of fear, and whites on the California frontier started to band together to exterminate the Indians. Many punitive actions against the Indians were financed by the state government, if you can imagine that. You'll learn more about writer Bret Harte in Chapter 12, but he chronicled one of the most heinous extermination incidents on the Northern California frontier up in what is now Arcata, California. You can see an excerpt on pages 151 to 152. There were threats against Hart's life after that. In spite of some attempts, especially in Southern California, very few California Indians were able to offer any kind of effective resistance against the military and quasi-military efforts against them. In Northern California, there was one effort against the white settlers in Modoc County in Northeast California. There was a battle which was called the Modoc War in 1873. A force of 400 soldiers tried to take the Modoc Indians, forced them to up in the lava beds, and eventually they were defeated, and their captain Kintpuash, who was captured. Unfortunately, the demise of the Indians continued, but there was one survivor of one tribe who was part of a tribe that was thought to be extinct, a fellow by the name of Ssci, who was actually discovered and learned about or studied by an anthropology professor at UC Berkeley.